Next, pleased to welcome Steve from Plymouth City Council. And Plymouth were one of the local authorities featured in the M&D report that Alex mentioned as having good practice around M&D and providing adaptations. So I reached straight out to Steve, and he said yes, and he's here today to tell us how kind of Plymouth supports people with M&D through the adaptations process. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Paul. I'm not sure how I follow that, to be honest. I mean, as a architect, technical officer by background before I took on the role of the manager of the DFG team in Plymouth, MND is an awful condition. I remember my first MND client that I worked with, and yeah, they hit quite hard, to be honest. So, hi everybody. Thanks to Paul and Foundations for inviting me along. Anytime that I'm asked to jump in and talk about DFG, I absolutely always will. I've put the strap line at the top there, which is the MND Association's Unlock the Door campaign, and I think the key bit for me is around the timescale should reflect the progression of the disease and not a standard housing service timescale. You know, it's really key to remember, especially for us that are involved in the grant process, that ultimately, in all cases, there is a human being at the end of this, and that's the reason that we're here to deliver. It's always really reassuring and a real compliment when you hear, you know, that your local authorities work and the work that you do every single day for my team in Plymouth is recognised nationally. So, you know, a massive shout out to the team that do what they do every day, and obviously it's a massive thing for that to be recognised, as I say, by the Casey report. So the DFG pathway, Plymouth, ultimately we move as quickly as we can. And what we've done is historically combined those good practice approaches, which Alex mentioned. And that's the bit that's been important for us to be able to progress cases ultimately for people with terminal conditions. I've done an extract from our policy which we did revise last year. That's the bit that ultimately relates to clinically fast tracked. We have done, will continue to work outside of policy in certain situations. And as Alex touched on with regards to the mean test, that's something that we ultimately will do where necessary. We have discretion within our discretionary assistance, to be able to do that. Yes, it's a 30 grand statutory DFG. We did amend our top up last year, so that went from 20 up to 30. So ultimately, it means that there is that effectively 60 grand pot there that is available with agreement for the discretionary top up. And again, you know, locally we can agree to waive that means test as well. So as it says there, you know, it does mention MND, but ultimately it covers somebody with a terminal illness or a prognosis of less than 12 months with a rapidly progressive condition. But I'm really pleased that we are able to mention MND specifically. With regards to the Unlock the Door campaign, I reached out to my service director. Alex and MND Association will probably be pleased to hear that we're already getting inquiries via local MPs and councillors, with clients actually being aware of and mentioning the Unlock the Door campaign. So I would say that already is gaining a good amount of traction, you know, within that field. The SR1 form, I haven't got a copy. I can get a link to it if anybody wants to see it. Ultimately, it's the medical evidence which a client is able to discuss with their occupational therapist and then get that submitted as part of their application. As it says, we move the case and application through to completion, and it's not subject to any prioritization process or means test. For the clinical fast tracks, that went right over my text then. Sorry, Paul. For the clinical fast tracks, gone right ahead. Paul, you threw me. It is done for a maximum of 10 grand, but that's in recognition that will cover a lot of the lower cost adaptations, which sometimes can meet the immediate and continuing need of people that have been diagnosed with MND. So, for example, you know, I think Alex mentioned bathroom adaptations. We have done it previously for people with a prognosis of MND, where we've installed a pod, and it's that consideration of rather than modifying the existing bathroom, is there potential to get that in somewhere within the property that could ultimately be a lot quicker, a lot less disruptive, and ultimately the client will get the benefit from that a lot sooner than they would if a full bathroom adaptation was put in place. The other thing, which I don't mean it inappropriately, but sometimes people want those adaptations removed following the passing of somebody that's been diagnosed with MND. It's a really difficult environment to working with MND, but ultimately we want it in as quickly as possible to gain the benefit, but also we want that reversibility, if you like, in certain circumstances where people wouldn't want a visual reminder of their relative that had passed away. Let me just find my controls. So the key factors basically with regards to how we deliver. So we're really fortunate that we've got 2 specialist housing OTs that work within the DFG team at Plymouth, and that gives us that sort of self-contained skill set, if you like, within the team. And what that does is that reduces delays in the adaptation planning, but also the progression of the case all the way through. We absolutely recognise MND as a progressive condition. Yes, DFG is not a fast process at heart or at its core, but what we can do is get all of those skill people and parties involved as early as possible, ultimately to be able to deliver that adaptation as quickly as possible. And then also, like was alluded to by Alex earlier, following the assessment, what we wouldn't necessarily want to do as a default is to trial a series of smaller adaptations. What we'd rather do is link in with our housing OTs or the referring OT. What is it that we need to provide as a one-stop shop to be able to meet the needs of that client, and then get that in the first situation, rather than having to go back through and have a repeated grant process, bearing in mind the short lifespan, of people with a prognosis. Strong partnership working. We do link as effectively the housing department. We do link and work very closely with adult social care and children's, I should say. We work very closely with Live Well, who effectively are the employees of the 2 housing OTs that we've got, and that are contractors, and we all work in unison, obviously with that shared goal of keeping somebody safe and independent within their own home. We focus on the functional outcomes to the client, so we want to keep people at home, especially with that MND prognosis. There isn't the actual time to be looking around at moving on grants and to be looking at a more suitable property, etc., etc. And ultimately, we wouldn't want to move somebody away from their support network that they would have established over lots of years, their working life. Like Alex said, ultimately what we want to do is to be able to provide those adaptations at home to make their lives comfortable, bearable and safe, possibly for those last few months that they have. And also the flexible prioritization. So yes, DFG is a process, but ultimately when we get those really fast clinical fast track cases, end of life cases, etc., what we look to do is to prioritize those cases over all of the cases that we've got, ultimately in recognition of a rapidly deteriorating condition, and that discretionary clause within our current policy gives us the flexibility to be able to do that. And finally, so I just wanted to show what this looks like. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to collate the information around MND clients generally, but what I did want to do is I reached out to one of our officers and looked at our most recent MND case. We can always be quicker. I would completely acknowledge that there are always ways to improve, and that's ultimately part of what we try to do in Plymouth. But if you look on there, we received the referral on the 4th of June this year. It was a valid application in less than a week. It was on our purchasing system, and the client's husband was updated within another 5 days. Bear in mind, these are dates that include weekends as well sometimes. It was awarded to a contractor 4 days later, which is a very quick turnaround. We received the quote on the 29th. That's only 10 days, but also across a weekend. The case was approved again on the same day as we received the quote, and that the contractor is already aware that this is a clinical fast track. It is for ceiling track hoists. So ultimately, there will be a lead-in time on those, but that's even where we would work with the contractor from the OT's assessment to say, the needs of this client. Do you have anything that is like a recycled, if it was a stair lift or something like that, or a hoist, is there anything that's recycled? Always with that key, we have to meet the client's needs, but ultimately, rather than going to the new market, is there something that we could use that might have been taken from somebody else's property, and ultimately it's in a storeroom and we can get that into the client's property as quickly as possible. So you'll all appreciate that things like 3-floor lifts have really, really long lead-in times. That's not a reason necessarily for us in Plymouth to go, okay, we just have to wait that amount of time. If there are different ways of doing it, like I said with the pods, with regards to a toilet, a shower, even a relatively level or ramped access shower, we're always happy to look at those, and also those quicker methods of construction as well, to be able to get that adaptation in for the client as quickly as possible. And then just to close, that timescale is typical of MND cases, but ultimately that happens because we don't want to be constrained by the process, and that the process happens one step after the other. As it says there, the occupational therapist, business support, the DFG grants officer, and also the contractor, those timescales can and do overlap in MND cases. And on the cases that I've worked on, it's not uncommon that you've got application forms being completed while you're there as the grants officer, with the contractor and the OT also on site. And ultimately, what might have taken a few weeks or months, etc., like Alex alluded to, you can do all of that within a really, really quick period. But obviously, it becomes completely resource intense. But that's a small price to pay, I would say, with regards to those adaptations being in as quickly as possible for the client. I'll hand back to you, Paul.
Few questions have come through, Steve. So, kind of both Amanda and Francisca have been talking about kind of removing adaptations if they're no longer required.
So what we would tend to do is we could the working relationship that we have with our contractors basically means that whether it's stair lift, 3-floor lift, hoists, etc., what we can do is ask them to remove it. So at that point, it's effectively free of charge, and then what they would do is charge us the installation or the installation cost. If there was a storage cost, that tends to be zero, but also if they've serviced it, that cost is then paid for by the future grant. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if it's somebody in sight and your husband or wife passed away, or your mum or your dad, ultimately you want that out as quickly as possible. We can do that really, really sensitively, very, very quickly, and there isn't any cost, if you like, to that existing client. They've donated it because it's effectively their equipment. They've donated it or given it back to us. We get that service cleaned up, etc., and then we can, as long as it meets that new client's needs, we can get it reinstalled in a new property, and that's the point at which we fund it.
So presumably you have kind of frameworks or other long-standing relationships with those suppliers or providers to offer that service.
It used to be more efficient, I'm not going to lie, because we had, for example, when we go back to stair lifts, we only had one supplier, going back to sort of Melissa's era, which you'll probably remember, Paul. But more recently, moving to that purchasing system, we do have multiple suppliers. So it could be more efficient, and that's part of obviously the ways that we're looking to improve going forward. But ultimately, yes. And what we can do through our purchasing system, if we know that a certain contractor is holding a stair lift or a hoist that will meet that client's needs, it's always going to be more cost and environmentally efficient to reinstall that in a new property than it is to obviously buy new again.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anybody who's watching, for any specialist equipment, you are permitted to put a condition on your grant approval that says it can be reclaimed if it's no longer required within 5 years. Which, yes, as Steve said, if you can, why wouldn't you? Robert asked about ceiling track hoists. You kind of, I mean, I think it's one of those kind of grey areas, isn't it, where it could be kind of minor abs or kind of social care, or it could be DFG. What's your view on ceiling track hoists, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, there are the freestanding ones, aren't there, that are on the frame, and there are the ones that are actually fixed. The myth that I was told when I first started as a grants officer was that in order for it to be DFG funded, it has to be fixed. And I think, when you're newer to the field of DFG, you sort of believe what you're told. As you get more experienced and more senior, you do tend to question those. Um, the simple version is we try not to get caught up in the is it a minor, is it a major between us and adult social care. There are ones which adult social care are funded over £1,000. There are ones that we funded that have been under. That, for me, that's not the point of it. You need to be looking at it and going, actually be client focused. If we're funding something under £1,000 and they're funding something over, it will balance out ultimately over time. At the moment, ceiling track hoists sit with us with regards to DFG. Um, there are conversations around moving that to the community equipment service, and there are benefits for doing that. But ultimately, they sit with us at present, and we DFG fund them.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose at the end of the day, it's if you're a service user or client or whatever, you're kind of looking for a service from the council, aren't you? And to them, whether it's one team or another, they don't really care as long as they get.
No, and we have a commissioned service in Plymouth. We have Live Well Southwest, and that's obviously the offer for OTs. Ultimately, yes, it's a separate organisation, but if you're a client and you phone up for triage all the way through to completion, it's almost irrelevant to you where that's coming from and who employs that member of staff. And actually, the weights, like Alex said, can be considerable, for one reason or another. Even with DFG, time you're looking at HA consents and surveyors reports and ground condition surveys and all that, and planning applications, the time scales around those can be considerable. And that's why, for example, if we're talking about M&D specifically, we've looked at pods and other ways of meeting the needs within the property, on the understanding or under the umbrella that actually this is a client that doesn't have that luxury of time to be looking at various options, etc. If there's something that we can do that will meet their need, we will do what we can to get that in as quickly as possible, even if that means that actually maybe in another scenario with a different condition, we might have looked at an extension to the property. It's around providing a reasonable adjustment for that client to enable them to live safely and independently for,
Yeah,
for the rest of their days,
yeah.
effectively.
I think Francisco's got another question around. Sorry, it's a slightly longer question, but I guess it's in terms of the information that comes or can come from social care. And I suppose for others, it might be that a case gets delayed in social care before it arrives at the housing team. I think you're kind of a little bit different from that in Plymouth. But any kind of anything you would maybe suggest to kind of Francisca or any other people that
Yeah, definitely. Francesca, I mean, I don't mean it to sound really obvious, but I would say link in with your colleagues in adult social care or children's, and have those conversations around actually that early heads up would make life so much easier, not for us as a team as DFG, but for the client. It's ultimately, it sounds as simple as saying, tell us that you've got those cases coming. And my the manager equivalent, if you like, in Live Well Southwest, I will get an email or a phone call or a heads up just to say, there's an MND case coming your way. This is the address. It enables you then to say, right, get an officer allocated as soon as possible, and then ultimately make it as pain free as possible. I'm really sorry if that sounds like a really simple, but and again, Francesca, I'm not aware of what your role is, but ultimately, I would say speak to your colleagues in adult social care, and have a conversation that actually would be really beneficial. Us knowing ahead of time, ultimately, a client's got to repeat their conversation and explain their journey more than once. So I'm an advocate for explain it once, state it at the beginning. That gets captured by the referring OT, and then that bit of information comes all the way through.
yeah, absolutely. And our next speaker is talking about pods, but there've been a couple of mentions of pods. I know you've done some kind of modular or kind of
We have,
prefabricated builds.
yeah.
So what's your kind of experience of I suppose kind of moving, or what led you to move away from traditional construction as a way to develop extensions?
Yeah, I would say a few things, Paul. One, it's a disruption to the client on site. They do tend to be more for children's cases, that there's less disruption on site. The quality control is going to be a bit easier to stay on top of because they're fabricated off site and they're ultimately driven to site and either craned over a building. But even when you take those costs into consideration, they were working out cheaper than the traditional construction, as well as the preparatory works carried out on site, and then they effectively bring the pod. I'm simplifying it a lot, I get that, but bringing it to site and effectively fixing it to the back of the building, or the plumbing, or the electrics, or the drainage, and that already exists within the pod, and ultimately you're fixing it into a pre-prepared rear or side of an existing building. We found them really, really good. We've got a couple that are. I think we did 3 altogether. So we have got a few that already exist, but we're also looking at timber frame. So we're never, we're never confined to actually going right. It's modular. That's the future. We've gone from traditional to modular. Now we're looking at timber frame as well. We've started and moved towards wall panels rather than more tiles. And there are ways that might save a little bit of time for the contractor. But if you save a bit of time for the contractor, ultimately you save a bit of cost as well, and the adaptation is delivered for the client a lot quicker. So yeah, I really like them. I really like the pods, but we're not gonna just stay there. We're gonna keep progressing and hopefully improving going forward.
Yeah, I think there's been quite a lot of development, isn't there? Certainly over the last few years. Kind of, if you're still only doing traditional construction, which takes a long time, creates a lot of mess, has a lot of cost uncertainty as well, particularly when you're looking at foundations, then a kind of a modular or pod, or we're going to have an example in a moment, saves a lot of time. And sometimes I think just on terms of the face of it, the costs look quite similar. But I think if anyone's done a few extensions, you can easily come across one where you then have to go down an extra metre and can cost £5,000-10,000 extra just in concrete that you get zero benefit from, other than the extension disappearing into the earth. Yes.
I agree. And you're digging into the ground, and that's always going to be an unknown, isn't it? You can do all the searches and everything like that. You can't do that intrusive survey. And it isn't, for me, it is traditional construction. It isn't just effectively the site of where the extension is being built. You also need somewhere then to be storing a skip. You need somewhere to be, like a site compound to be storing materials, etc. Because if you don't, it's off site, and then that increases the cost, etc. So, there's always lots of considerations in that respect. But yeah, the pod seems a lot more straightforward, but ultimately you have to look at each case on its own merits.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. We may come back to you in a little while if there are more questions, but for now, really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.